All right, we're going to pick up here with our last part, talking about some general anatomy of the brain. We'll look at some structural areas, and then we'll also talk about some functional areas as part of those. So you have likely seen a brain before in terms of maybe like a model or a picture. When you look at that brain, you've noticed, or hopefully you've noticed, that that brain is not smooth. It's not perfectly smooth on the outside, but there are these ridges and there's these valleys and these wrinkles on the brain. And so what these ridges are called gyri. If we're talking about more than one, they're called gyri. If we're talking about just one of them, it is called a gyrus. All right. Now, next to and adjacent to these gyri are things called sulci or sulci, all right, or a sulcus. If we're talking about just one of them. These are the valleys or these grooves adjacent to the gyri. All right. And then anytime we have a larger or a deeper sulcus, we just call that a fissure. Okay, so we'll see that our brain is full of important gyri, is full of important sulci, and then is also full of different fissures as well. So if we're looking here on this left image, we see various gyri, these folds everywhere. We also see sulci. So here's one important one called the central sulcus. We'll talk about this in a second. And then we can also see large fissures. We have one very large fissure running right down the middle of the brain, dividing the brain into left and right hemispheres, and this is called the longitudinal fissure. Okay, so if we look at this brain here to the left again, we see this region in the middle called the central sulcus. This is called the central sulcus because it runs roughly in the center of the brain. So here's the back, way back here. Here's the anterior. Here's the front. So this is somewhere in the middle, somewhere in the center. This central sulcus is present in all humans, so in all of our brains. Now, it won't always necessarily look this obvious and this clean, but we have a general area in our brain where we have this general structure. So this central sulcus, it divides two very prominent and two very generally obvious gyri. And so right in front of it, here's our central sulcus. Right in front or anterior, we have something known as the precentral gyrus. It's called precentral because it's right in front of, or it's right in front of the central sulcus. So if this is the precentral gyrus, right, running right in front, what do you think this one right here behind is called? Hopefully you're saying this is the postcentral gyrus, and that's exactly what it is, right? So these are structural parts of the brain. You look at it, this is a structure. You can see it. This is a structural part. This is an actual form. This is the form, this is the structure of the brain. A part of these structural regions, of this precentral gyrus and of this postcentral gyrus, are what are called functional areas or functional regions of the brain. So as part of our precentral gyrus, there is something known as the primary motor cortex. Okay, this is what is directing and essentially initiating where our signal initiates for our motor activity. So if you want to move your fingers, you want to move your leg, you want to move your head or something, your neck, that motor signal is coming from this precentral gyrus, which contains the primary motor cortex. This postcentral, so if this is motor in front, this one behind you may be thinking, well, this is the sensory, and it is. This is the primary somatosensory cortex. And so this is where we have our senses, our different sensations, come back to the brain, and it is where we are made aware of it. So this is where we actually perceive it. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll talk about the difference between sensation and perception. But in general, these two are organized in what is called a topographical organization, meaning that specific areas of the body are destined to go to or arise from a specific part of these gyri. So if we're thinking about the sensory cortex, if you were to stub your toe and you were to shut your hand in a door, these sensations travel back to the brain and end up in different parts of this postcentral gyrus. They end up in different parts of this primary somatosensory cortex because it is arranged in this topographical organization. And we'll look at another slide here in a second of something called the sensory and the motor homunculus. All right, and the homunculus is essentially this kind of distorted figure that is stretched over one of these gyri that gives a representation of where different parts of the body are located within these gyri. Okay, so if we look at the first large part of our brain, we have the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe here is shown in blue. It underlies the frontal bone. This is where we have that precentral gyrus. So again, here's that central sulcus here in the middle. And just anterior to that, this large cortical wrinkle is known as the precentral gyrus, right? So you can see that there. This is what, again, this is controlling voluntary motor movement. So going out to our skeletal muscle, okay? So we also have something known as the lateral sulcus, or sometimes known as the lateral or the sylvian fissure. That is this large groove that you see here at the end of my cursor, hopefully you can see this, that divides the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe and also somewhat divides the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe as well, okay? So our frontal lobe, you may know, controls, so we said motor activity. It also controls lots of higher order thinking type functions. So things like communication, decision-making, critical thinking, our ability to plan and reason, our personality as well. So this is the site that becomes inhibited and becomes impaired with increased alcohol consumption, right? So if you think about increased alcohol consumption and what you typically think of associated with that, you see deficits in these different things. So you may be, you may have poor balance, so poor motor control. You probably are unable to focus and have very good concentration. You may slur words, you may talk differently, so verbal communication. Your decision making, your critical thinking, your planning ability, are all altered, and obviously your personality changes as well, okay? So one really good way to learn functions of different parts of the brain is to know what happens to that part of the brain when it is inhibited or when something goes wrong, okay? So the second part is known as the parietal lobe. So this is just posterior to our frontal lobe. It contains the post-central gyrus, which we said contains the primary sensory or primary somatosensory cortex. It is also kind of in contact and borders the temporal lobe as well as the occipital lobe more posteriorly. It's divided from the occipital lobe by this parieto-occipital sulcus. It has a couple of different sensory functions in terms of things like evaluating shape and texture of objects. So this, you can think of this in the sense that if you had 5 dimes, 5 nickels, 5 pennies, and 5 quarters in your pocket, there's a pretty good likelihood that you could have those in your pocket, mix them up, put your hand in your pocket, and you could sort those and pull out all of the quarters first, all of the dimes, all the pennies, all the nickels. You could do that probably pretty accurately, right? Now, you may mix up a dime and a penny or something like that, but for the most part, you're going to be pretty accurate. So this is this idea that we're able to evaluate the shape and the texture and the size and the feel of different things from previous experience and previous memory, and this is in part due to the parietal lobe. Now we also have the temporal lobe lying deep to the temporal bone. So here we see it in this kind of dark blue color here. So here's our temporal lobe. It is located inferior to that lateral sulcus or that sylvian fissure or the lateral fissure, and it is the primary destination for a couple of our special senses, including hearing and smell. So our primary auditory cortex for hearing and our primary olfactory cortex ultimately make their way back to the temporal lobe, where we are then made aware of them. So our last kind of main lobe of the brain that we can see from a very superficial external view is the occipital lobe, right? And so it's you probably know, and it's kind of commonly known that the occipital lobe has something to do with vision, right? And so we have our optic nerve, or our second cranial nerve, that detects or transmits stimuli, light stimulus that strikes our retina, strikes our photoreceptors, is transmitted along our retina to the optic nerve. And both optic nerves go to both sides of the brain, essentially, or they have branches that go to both sides of the brain. So the right eye sends signals to both the left and right side of the brain, and the left eye sends signals to both the left and the right side of the brain. And we'll talk about this in more detail whenever we do our special senses lecture. Right. So the last real lobe of the brain that we can see is called the insula, or the insular lobe. And this is one that you can't see from a superficial view, but if you pull the parietal and frontal lobes away from the temporal lobe, you can see this little cortical wrinkle, and this is what we see right here in purple. And this has some different functions in regards to memory and our sense of taste as well. So we'll see when we do our special senses lecture, we have different types of there are different tastes, and we perceive these in different ways. Okay, so whenever we continue looking at the brain, we see another region known as the brain stem. So the brain stem is continuous inferiorly with our spinal cord. And there are three general parts of the brainstem, and we'll talk about them in detail. There's the medulla, most inferiorly. That's a relay station primarily between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. It also contains things called the pyramids, and more laterally things called the olives, and these have to do with some of our motor activity. We have the region called the pons, which is this large red region kind of in the middle, this large swollen bulbous region in the middle. This is largely a relay station for ascending sensory information and descending motor information to go from the brain out to the periphery, or from the periphery all the way up to the brain. And then we have this light blue region known as the midbrain, which has to do with transmitting signals, again, from the brain to the spinal cord, or from the spinal cord to the brain, as well as coordinating reflexes. So things like auditory reflexes responding to sound, and visual reflexes responding to light or some type of visual stimulus. So when we look at our midbrain first, we'll primarily focus on the midbrain and the medulla. We have something known as the cerebral peduncles. So a peduncle in anatomy in general is just a structure that connects one part of the brain to another part, right? So if we look down here at this section, and again, if we go back here, and if I make an annotation just briefly, what we're looking at is if we took a section here, and we looked at our midbrain, and we took a section right through here. So we made a section like this, and we looked down onto this section right here. What we would be looking at is something that looks like this right here, down here. So we said that the cerebral peduncle, this is a structure that connects one region of the brain to another, and this is running from the midbrain, and it continues inferiorly, and it allows motor signals, so descending efferent signals, to go from the brain through the midbrain, through the brainstem, all the way down the spinal cord. And this is part of our pyramidal system. And when we do our motor system or our motor pathway lecture, we'll talk more about this in a little bit more detail. So again, we're carrying voluntary motor commands out of the brain. We also have something known as the superior cerebellar peduncle. So again, we have this term peduncle. This is connecting our midbrain with our cerebellum. And again, it is transmitting some motor information from the cerebrum to the cerebellum prior to this information going out to the periphery to initiate some type of motor activity. We also have something known as the medial lemniscus. And so we'll talk about the medial lemniscus whenever we do some more sensory discussions in the next lecture. But the medial lemniscus is part of what's called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And this is an ascending pathway. And anytime we're talking about ascending pathways, we're talking about sensory information, right? Because it's ascending. It's going up in the spinal cord, up toward the brain, so that has to be sensory. So it contains ascending fibers that are coming from the periphery. So they're coming from the lower limb, they're coming from the upper limb, and they're carrying with it pain information, temperature, touch, pressure, vibration, all these different things. Okay? So you can see this little section right down here, right in this area here. And the last main structure, we have lots of structures here, but the last main one is something known as the substantia nigra. And the term substantia nigra translates to dark stuff or dark substance. The reason it is dark is because there are cells here that produce that pigment melanin. So this is the same pigment that we find in our skin that gives our skin our pigmentation. It also produces something known as dopamine. So you've probably heard of dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, and the main thing with the substantia nigra and dopamine is we typically think of it in terms of this disease known as Parkinson's disease. All right. So Parkinson's disease is a nervous system disorder that is characterized by a loss of motor activity and loss of motor regulation as a result of the decrease in the dopamine production. So dopamine has kind of an inhibitory effect on motor movement, and what it specifically does is it coordinates and works with something known as the basal nuclei. The basal nuclei, which is a group of internal cell bodies located deep within the brain that control and coordinate our muscle activity. And so the dopamine can inhibit and kind of regulate some of this motor activity, and what it does is it prevents excess motor activity from happening. So what you see in Parkinson's disease is when you lack the dopamine, you have those extraneous, those additional, unnecessary motor movements. So this is why if you've ever seen somebody with Parkinson's disease, they may be shuffling their gait. They may have kind of arm tremors. They may be tremoring with their hand at their wrist. They have this unnecessary, extraneous motor activity as a result of the lack of dopamine production. So the next part we'll talk about is the medulla. So the medulla is the most inferior or the most caudal part of our brainstem, continuous with the spinal cord inferiorly. And it contains lots of different nuclei. Okay? And so again, when you think of the term nuclei, we're thinking of a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system. That's what we're talking about. So we have different centers in the medulla, and these centers control different autonomic functions. So we have one called the cardiac center and the vasomotor center. Okay, sometimes this is known as the cardiovascular center. And so what this controls is our heart rate and our blood vessel tone and diameter, respectively, right? So the cardiac center is regulating heart's output, the rate of the heart, its beating and contraction and whatnot. The vasomotor center is controlling the tone and the diameter of our blood vessels, right? So influencing blood pressure depending on bodily needs and homeostasis. We also have a region known as the medullary respiratory center. This is controlling our respirations, right? So our respiratory rate and our breathing rate. You contain both a dorsal and a ventral respiratory groups, and you can also see these over here. And these have excitatory and inhibitory effects on respiration. Okay. Then you also have other nuclei that have important autonomic functions, and specifically for things like reflexes. So coughing, sneezing, vomiting, salivating, swallowing. A lot of these are autonomic reflexes that we don't really think about, but they are controlled by some medullary nuclei within our medulla. Okay. So if we move past the brainstem, we can also see a region known as the cerebellum. So we've talked about the cerebellum briefly. Cerebellum translates to small brain, and it has a couple of different parts. So one part is known as the arbor vitae. So arbor vitae, if you look at this image to the left, hopefully you can see these little white matter projections that extend up through here like this. There's another one right here. There's another one here. There's one down here. These are all white matter projections within the cerebellum. So the term arbor vitae means tree of life. So arbor refers to tree, and vitae, vital, means life. So this is the tree of life. This is essentially just the white matter projections within the cerebellum, just like we had white matter within the cerebrum and within the brain itself, right? So we also have a region known as the flocculonodular lobe. So the flocculonodular lobe is this small little region that we see here in blue, and this blue region that we see highlighted right here. This is a very primitive region of the cerebellum. It's relatively simple and basic, and it controls things like balance and eye movements. We also have a region known as the vermis. The vermis is this midline region that we see running right here. So the term vermis means worm or worm-like, and it's largely connecting the two lateral hemispheres that we'll talk about next, and also has important functions regarding posture, locomotion, and fine motor movement and coordination. And then lastly, we have these lateral hemispheres. So we have a lateral hemisphere here, and we have another lateral hemisphere over here. And these have to do with things like learning, practicing, planning out complex movements that are very specific and very particular. Okay. So in general, our cerebellum is controlling and managing and coordinating motor activity with respect to coordination and balance and posture and muscle tone and proprioception and kind of all these related functions. So we next have the diencephalon. The diencephalon is a middle kind of internal region of the brain that we cannot see. We cannot see it superficially. We have to section the brain. So here we've sectioned the brain in a sagittal section, and we're looking at the medial aspect of the right side of the brain, of the right hemisphere. So this kind of whole region, kind of all in here, this is kind of all the diencephalon. Okay. So the diencephalon consists of a couple of parts. One of them is the thalamus. The thalamus you can think of largely as a relay center for most of our sensory information. So if sensory information is coming from the periphery and it's going to reach our consciousness and reach our perception and our cerebrum, it has to pass through the thalamus, and we'll see all senses pass through except for our sense of smell. Okay. We also have a region known as the subthalamus. This is largely controlling motor activity. We have a region known as the epithalamus, kind of right back in here. This is controlling emotions and whatnot, but it also has to do with our biological clock. So if you think about the circadian rhythm and our sleep-wake cycle, we have an important gland, and this is what we can see if I hide this here, and I highlight it, this small little circle that we see right here. This is a gland that's known as the pineal gland, right? So the pineal gland makes and secretes the hormone melatonin, and so melatonin is an important regulator and controller of our sleep-wake cycle. Now, I always talk about melatonin in class, and so one important thing about melatonin is it is oftentimes taken as a supplement to aid in sleep, right? So there can be melatonin gummies and melatonin little supplements and whatnot that people can take to help them sleep. The thing about taking something exogenously that our body makes endogenously is that if we continue to take it from an outside source, over time, our internal production can decrease because our body senses that we have an ample amount, right? We have sufficient melatonin in our body because we're getting it from our supplement. So our pineal gland needs to, it no longer needs to produce as much, so it's going to slow down. Well, what happens whenever you decide to stop taking your melatonin supplement, right? Well, you're not taking it from a supplement, and your pineal gland is not making it, so now you don't have any, right? So this is why anytime you take something from an outside source in the form of a medication or a pill or a supplement, you take something from an outside source exogenously that your body normally makes endogenously, so within the body, when you stop it, you have to taper it, okay? So if you've ever had an infection or you're feeling ill and sick and you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you a steroid, some pills, that steroid is likely in a tapered format, okay? Or in other words, you would take it in a tapered fashion. So for the first so many days, you may take so many milligrams, and then the next few days you take a little bit smaller dose, and then a little bit smaller, and a little bit smaller, and so on until you finish. The reason for that is that our body naturally makes corticosteroids in our adrenal gland, right, in our adrenal cortex. So we have to taper our use so that we do not all of a sudden stop taking it, but our adrenal gland has also stopped making it, and we're left with nothing, right? So we have to taper it off. Same thing goes here. Same thing is true here with our melatonin. And the last part is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has important physiological processes, so this is essentially our internal thermostat here. The hypothalamus also is a major endocrine gland or a major endocrine tissue that we'll talk about in ANP2. It makes a couple of hormones. It makes what are called releasing and inhibiting hormones, and it also makes two important hormones known as oxytocin and ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. And again, you'll talk about that when you do an endocrine system lecture. All right, so if we're looking at our cerebrum, we see that we have all of these kind of colored and shaded regions, and these are all specific, what are called functional areas, okay? So we talked about two structural areas. The two structural areas were this precentral gyrus and this postcentral gyrus, right? So the precentral was right here in pink, right? And the postcentral is right here in blue, okay? So this precentral is containing the primary motor cortex, so regulating motor activity. Our postcentral is containing the primary somatosensory cortex, okay? But you see you have all of these other areas. So we have visual cortices back here in the occipital lobe. We have auditory cortex in our temporal lobe, right? We have olfactory bulb here. We have structures or regions known as Wernicke's area and something known as Broca's area. These two have to do with speech and language. And so you can imagine what would happen if you had a stroke to one of these areas. We're going to have deficits according to which region is now, impaired with the lack of blood flow. So a common one that you can think of is if you have a stroke that impairs blood flow to this Broca's area right here, the patient is likely going to have difficulties in producing speech. So the initiation of spoken language. Okay, they may know and be aware of what to say, but the actual process of initiating it and actually speaking is what is difficult. Okay, so we move on here, we can see some of these different functional areas. So you can see primary gustatory cortex, olfactory, auditory, visual, somatosensory. And then we have this Wernicke's area here. And again, this has to do with understanding written and spoken language, so the comprehension of language. Okay. So this structure here, this is what we mentioned earlier with this idea of something called a homunculus. All right. So the homunculus, in this case, this is showing our sensory homunculus. So what this is showing is the distribution of different body parts and different body regions on this gyrus. So on this fold of brain tissue right here, right? So if this is sensory, then what gyrus is this? What gyrus is involved in sensory information? Well, hopefully you remember it is the post-central gyrus. Okay, so behind that central sulcus. So this homunculus is a representation of all of this sensory information and where it goes. So if we were to, as the example we gave earlier, if we were to stub our toe, the signal would ultimately come up and it would be relayed here. Whereas if we were to shut our finger in a door, then that information would come out here, right? If we were to get something in our eye, a piece of dust in our eye, it would come out somewhere over here, right? If we were to bite our tongue, it would come somewhere over here. So the idea here is that specific sensory information is mapped to a specific area of this postcentral gyrus. Now, let's say for a second that this is not a sensory cortex, but this is now our primary motor cortex, okay? So let me actually get rid of this. This is our primary motor cortex now. So this is primary motor, right? Say we want to initiate movement to our fingers. We want to type, or we want to grasp something, or we want to move our fingers to write. Well, that signal is going to start here, and it is going to flow down into the spinal cord down here. Say we want to move our leg. Well, it's going to start here, and it's going to come down this way. Say we want to move our lips. It's going to come here. We want to move our elbow. It's going to come from here. So again, if this was a motor homunculus, it would be the same thing, but the information is coming in a different way, right? So if this is sensory, the information is coming in. If this is motor, the information is coming out, okay? All right. So the last structure here that we'll talk about is something known as the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is part of our limbic system, or our kind of emotional brain or emotional system. And this has to do with lots of memory information. So spatial memory, so knowing and identifying and remembering the location of things. Verbal memory, learning and computational information, as well as where we store new memories. Okay, and so you could go on and talk a lot about different types of memory, short-term memory and long-term memory and relational memory and all these different things. But in general, the hippocampus, which are these yellow structures that we see here, this is the general site for sensory or for motor, for memory information, excuse me. So that is the end of our lecture for our central nervous system. So we covered a lot of information. And so please take your time to review all of these different parts, review the appropriate chapters in the textbook, and please always, if you feel that you have any questions, please reach out, and I will be happy to answer any questions. All right, I will see you in the next video.